Americans fought a war for independence over British taxation. Remember Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party? And then to pay for that war that they fought over taxation, the new US government raised taxes on whiskey, thinking, surely no one is going to get upset about whiskey like that whole tea thing. Rebellion! Insurgency! Poor farmers rose up violently in defense of their whiskey. President George Washington stopped the revolt and shortly after issued the very first presidential pardons, sparing 2 men who had been sentenced to death. Clemency is a presidential power written into the Constitution. It has a pretty interesting history and a lot of power to shape the future. So, on this episode of Let's Connect, we're going to connect World War I seditionists over here to the war on drugs over here. Spoiler alert, the connection is Clemency. Oh, and at some point, we'll mention this ridiculous Richard Nixon tattoo. So let's begin with some quick history on Clemency to get us to World War I. In 1795, Washington grants the first pardons to angry Pennsylvanians who don't want to pay a 30% tax on whiskey. Presidents Jefferson and Madison pardoned army deserters in order to rebuild their ranks in times of national peril. On Christmas Day, 1868, Johnson granted pardons to all those who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Done under the guise of renewing confidence in the Union, this was one of many ways President Johnson prevented Black Americans from gaining political power. Now, let's jump to World War I. World War I was at the time called the War to End All Wars. If only it had. It was a global, worldwide conflict. For the first 3 years of the war, the United States remained neutral. As public opinion changed following German attacks on US merchant ships, President Woodrow Wilson committed America to the conflict. But of course, public opinion is not a monolith, and not everyone was in favor of the war. Americans of Irish, German, Scandinavian descent, as well as church leaders and leaders of the women's movement, opposed joining the conflict. So, worried that anti-war rhetoric from these groups would undermine the war effort, Wilson and Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1918, which criminalized disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the US government or military. Though the ACLU didn't exist yet to fight this abuse of the First Amendment, one of our founders, Roger Baldwin, led the only national organization to speak out against it, the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which incidentally did lead to the founding of the ACLU. So we don't know exactly how many people were imprisoned under the Sedition and Espionage Acts, but it was likely in the thousands. Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge pardoned hundreds of these prisoners, and the newly formed ACLU joined a committee that campaigned for amnesty for all people who had been convicted for their political views during World War I. Eventually, in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt issued amnesty to all of the war protesters, saying, "The emergency that made it necessary to punish them has long expired." Now let's jump to a very different war. In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared that drug abuse was America's public enemy #1, thus declaring war on drugs. This followed the passage of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which began categorizing drugs based on their medicinal use and potential for addiction. This also occurred amidst reports of the rise in heroin addiction amongst soldiers in Vietnam. Now, just as Johnson had granted pardons to ex-Confederate soldiers to diminish a rise in Black political power, and Wilson had passed laws that violated Americans' First Amendment rights in order to protect American war interests, Nixon was doing the same two things. He waged the war on drugs to combat the anti-war left, protecting American war interests, and the war on drugs attacked Black communities, diminishing Black political power. The war on drugs was basically a way to punish people who disagreed with Nixon and his allies. Interestingly, while an increasing number of people were imprisoned for drug offenses under President Nixon himself was spared criminal proceedings with perhaps the most famous presidential pardon. You know, this one.
Good evening, I'm Dan Rather. President Ford has granted Richard Nixon a, quote, full, free, and absolute all offenses the former president committed or may have committed while in office.
President Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon for any crimes Nixon might have committed during the Watergate scandal. So the prison populations in America were on the rise, but Tricky Dick was not among them. The war on drugs doesn't end with Nixon. In fact, it hasn't ended. In the 80s, Reagan exclaimed, "We're running up a battle flag," and ratcheted up attacks on drug possession and use. More funding from Congress, more mandatory minimum sentences, and an ever greater racial disparity in arrests and sentencing. Every successive president since has inherited the war on drugs and continued the combative approaches of their predecessors. And with the militarization of our domestic law enforcement, the war on drugs has increasingly come to look more and more like a traditional war. So, step one is we need to end the war on drugs, which we will get into in more detail in the next episode. But step two involves clemency, which is the connection that takes us from George Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion through World War I, the Nixon administration, and even the Trump administration and Roger Stone, a former Trump advisor who was convicted of lying to Congress, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering before getting pardoned by Trump. Wait a second. This guy, who got a pardon from this guy, actually has a tattoo of this guy on his back? This guy was pardoned for involvement in a political scandal by this guy, just like how this guy, who has a tattoo of this guy, was indicted for lying to Congress about his and this guy's involvement in a political scandal? So this guy shields this guy by lying, and then this guy pardons this guy who has a tattoo on his back of this guy? Pardon me? Truth truly is stranger than fiction. Anyway, clemency is the connection across all of this history, and it can be the connection for the war on drugs, too. The fact is, the United States incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. 2.3 million individuals are in jail or prison today, and almost 500,000 people are incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Black people are imprisoned at 5.9 times the rate of white people. For Latinx people, it's 3.1 times. This whole system needs to be fixed. But for the people currently serving unduly harsh sentences, we do have a mechanism with which we can show mercy and compassion, where we can release them from their sentences and return them to their communities. Clemency. Presidents and governors have a long history of using their clemency powers to correct broad, systemic injustices that impacted large categories of people. Categorical clemency. It's been used in wars to forgive deserters, and it's been used after wars to forgive those who, whether justly or not, stood in opposition to the United States. Again, when pardoning World War I seditionists, FDR said, "The emergency that made it necessary to punish them has long expired." Over the last 5 decades of the war on drugs, the emergency that made it necessary to incarcerate millions never truly existed. So these unjust sentences should expire. On the next episode of Let's Connect, we're going to break down what ending the war on drugs means, and we'll discuss different ways the president and governors might use clemency to confront mass incarceration and racial injustice. We'll give you actions that you can take right now, so be sure to connect with us by subscribing to our channel, and don't miss the next episode of Let's Connect.